Unlike my other multi-game reviews where I cover each game in release order with its own dedicated section, this is going to be primarily a Bayonetta 3 review, but since I haven't talked about the series before on my channel, I wanted to establish my thoughts and feelings on the first two games. Pretty much everything there is to say about these games has been said before, and I'm in no way a super knowledgeable player of the finer mechanics of it, so this will not be a deep dive of the first two games. I know it is a faux pas to open your video by saying, it ain't going to be that interesting, in fact it might be boring and you're going to be hearing nothing but opinions that you've heard before, but that's honestly how I kind of feel about my Bayonetta 1 and 2 sections, so if my opinions on the first two games and where I sit with feeling about them doesn't interest you, use the YouTube chapter feature to jump to the Bayonetta 3 review. This will be spoiling the entirety of Bayonetta 1 through 3, so if you have any intention of playing them and don't want to be spoiled, do that first. Bayonetta 1 was a game I admired a lot, but it was never one I cared about as much as any of the Devil May Cry games. I still really liked it, but as someone who is never going to play this game at a mechanically high level, the best I can really do is just appreciate what it's going for. Now on my fourth playthrough of the game I did leading up to the release of 3, it felt like the game finally clicked into place more than it ever has. I'm still bad at this game, but it just felt so natural this playthrough. Maybe it's because of all of the PlayStation 2 action games I've played lately have awoken my third eye, and I can now really appreciate this game on a level I could not before. I think it also helped that this time around I just accepted that I suck and tried to just enjoy the game without the obsession of being the best at it. If I got all stone ranks, that's fine because I was having fun and knew I was actually learning rather than just beating my head against a brick wall trying to get gold. A lot of things I remember disliking about this game finally clicked for me. Until this playthrough, I wasn't that much of a fan of how almost weightless Bayo initially seems. To a novice, she felt, dare I say, the dreaded word of action game reviews and criticism. She felt floaty. Back in the day, and hell, even now, I much more enjoyed the weightiness of Devil May Cry or Ninja Gaiden. But now, I feel like I finally wrapped my head around it. I can enjoy that weightlessness of Bayo and actually use it to my advantage like the game intended. Target selection with the lock-on still feels kind of finicky, which led me to not having a good grasp of doing dive kicks and heel kicks accurately. After testing and analyzing this game's systems for another upcoming video on Solstice and action game design as a whole, I finally have a firm grasp on how this game's lock-on works, and it is probably the best implementation in the genre. Depending on where Bayo is facing and where your analog sticks are pointing is who the game is going to prioritize for your lock-on. The motorcycle level does not feel nearly as bad this time around, but maybe I have just fully developed Stockholm Syndrome from playing all of Platinum's games, thinking that Wonderful 101 is easily their best, and also playing all of Suda51's games since these genre shifts are the lifeblood of these two companies. Though the Space Harrier level at the end of the game felt even longer this time around, but that might have been just because I was tired while playing, but it is easily still my least favorite part of the game. The only other thing which I will say now is going to be a recurring complaint throughout this entire video is that I do not like the limit of 2 weapon sets. It's cool that you can mix and match weapons on your hands and feet, but otherwise I would enjoy being able to have more to cycle through so weapons don't end up being ignored. If you are someone who has bounced off or struggled with the game, my word of advice is just try not to worry about ratings on your first playthrough. Focus on having fun and taking it slow. This game lets you go really fast and it feels good to do so, but when you are new to the game, going fast and mashing is going to end up getting you punished. If I had to say I learned anything from replaying this game for this video, or just making this part of the video for the review itself, it is reaffirming my thoughts and beliefs on just how hard it is to review these types of games, especially if you are someone who is not good at them. You can play these games multiple times over the span of years and only feel like you finally get them a decade later. These games have such huge learning curves and mechanical depth to them that making a review on them right away feels pointless, unless you plan to make an updated version of your review or a follow-up review later. Like, I can't imagine if I made a review for the first time I ever played DMC1 a million years ago, because I initially didn't like that game because I played 3 first when I was a kid. But now DMC1 is probably my favorite in the series because the game is super unique and there's nothing else quite like it. Personally speaking, I don't really like the idea of redoing or remaking reviews and videos because it's the same reason I don't like remakes of games. It is very easy to fall in the trap of just slightly changing and iterating and remaking the same thing over and over again, chasing this mythological, non-existent perfection, rather than just acknowledging your mistakes and shortcomings and actually growing as a creator by building off of them with new creations. There is probably an interesting and necessary conversation to be had about how these games teach you and expect you to learn, and the environments they want you to learn in. Personally speaking, I'm not someone who really enjoys consulting guides when playing games. I just want to play the game myself and not have to constantly stop and consult guides or YouTube videos to figure out how to do things. But unless you're someone who really knows how to get the most out of these games and dissect information or discern information out of them, you are inevitably going to miss mechanics and the finer details of a game by not consulting those guides and YouTube videos, because the game does not teach you at all, or at least in a conventional way, new information about their systems. And then that's going to in turn end up hurting your review and analysis of the game, because you could easily miss something that is vital to your success. Or in turn, all of your criticisms and complaints about the game can just be responded with, actually, here is what you were supposed to do. In reality, that boss you were struggling on and thought was bullshit and unfair is surprisingly really easy when you do this. Here is this mechanic or facet of the game you had no idea existed, but understanding it is vital to your success and enjoyment. How was I supposed to figure this out without getting outside information from either going through a Reddit, or Twitter thread, going through a guide, having someone straight up tell me, or seeing it in a YouTube video? And then how are you supposed to know which information and advice is right or wrong? You are going to run into conflicting information, and people are going to be straight up wrong and act as if they aren't. And that's not their fault either. They most definitely just saw and thought this was how the mechanic worked because it wasn't actually explained clearly by the game itself. Unless we have direct confirmation from a dev that worked on the game, or from the game's code itself somehow, when doing your own testing on how the systems of these games work, it is very easy to get false positives. I would bet money that most people who are smug about, you didn't get this mechanic, you didn't understand this, is not someone who figured these types of games out for themselves. They absolutely saw some outside information from somebody else and just learned from it, which there isn't anything wrong with. This genre massively benefits from having someone guide your hand and teach you as you play so you can get the best possible experience. But even in saying all of this and getting this frustration out of my system, that doesn't negate the feeling. Due to the nature of your YouTube videos being a snapshot of who you are and your opinions at a very given moment, it feels almost like you're trapped and beholden to those opinions, which is not how regular people or how having opinions works. As someone who has bumbled their way through making videos up until this point and has only gotten to where I am by luck and pure stubbornness and dedication at the cost of all logic and mental well-being due to mental illness, it is one of the many things that makes me feel uncomfortable about making certain videos. That feeling of underqualification to speak on a subject is very real, and I honestly don't know how to tackle it, which is something that these games really manage to bring out with their mechanical complexity and demand for execution. I finally played Bayonetta 2 to completion a few days before 3 came out, and even as someone who is a complete novice to this game, it feels like a pretty noticeable step down mechanically as soon as you get your hands on it. Before I get into my negatives about this game, I want to talk about the positives. This game is a feast for the eyes. I love how vibrant and colorful everything is. It gives this game such a fun and irresistibly charming energy to it. The music is also amazing. Tomorrow Is Mine is such a great song. Presentation-wise, this game feels like what you would want from a big sequel. Depending on who you're asking, this may not be a positive, but I for one am happy that there are no longer the really frustrating arena hazards when fighting enemies, like needing to dodge incoming cars on Highway 666 when fighting the Bayonetta clones. Unfortunately, that's where the praise ends, so let's start off with some light criticism and say that I do not like the dialogue to this game, and it actively makes the story hard to engage with. Loki has the same issue I brought up in my Gungrave Overdose review, where characters just repeat the same shit over and over again as if it's a character trait. I cannot tell you a single line he has other than, I have to get to Fimbulvinter! Luca is way more annoying in this game for the same reasons. He doesn't really have anything to do in this game now that the plot with his father was resolved in the previous one. The villain of this game falls completely flat. I couldn't tell you a single thing about him other than his name is Lopter, which made me think of Hampter. I did like the Lumen Sage stuff. Seeing him before he became corrupted in the villain of the first game was neat, but generally I dislike time travel plots, especially in something like this. I also think I've come to the conclusion after this game that I simply do not like plots where the whole thing is we have to get the party to X location, because it's always the same thing of conveniently getting set back even farther, halting progress.
Oh, we were right there, man!
On the mechanical side of things, this game just feels different as soon as you get into the first combat encounter, and not in a good way. It's flashy and looks great for videos, but there is a noticeable weirdness to the weight of enemies when trying to do air combos. Like, the enemies weigh more now, so they just tend to fall out of your combos from the gravity pushing them down because your hits don't keep them in the air. For some reason, they got rid of my favorite feature about the movement in Bayo 1, which is the momentum from the Panther within. In the original game, when you transformed and started running forward, if you jumped and hit RT to transform back into human, you would get sent flying forward like a missile. This made gap closing and platforming incredibly fun and fluid. Now in 2, if you try to do the same thing as soon as you transform back to a human, you fall down and lose all momentum. Why? Why did they make the game feel worse? Witch time doesn't last very long in this game, but also so many enemies require it to even interact with them, so it's really bizarre. I saw this comment on the Bayonetta subreddit when looking into how the witch time worked in Bayonetta 2, and it revealed to me that the witch time is based on enemy attacks, not on your timing of dodging like it was in 1. So that explains the incredibly inconsistent feeling of witch time that I experienced in my playthrough. I thought I was simply doing something wrong, not getting a properly timed dodge, so I got a reduced witch time, but that's not the case. Some weapons in this game are really cool, but there are some real stinkers here, like the hammer, which I stopped using after 2 encounters. I really dislike slow weapons in these types of games, and the combat already feels off, so it wasn't doing it any favors. The bow feels incredibly out of place in this game. It's for the 5 lab-escaped vat-grown skinwalkers that seem to like DMC2's gameplay. I'm fully willing to accept that I could have completely missed the point of this weapon, and it's actually really good and useful in combat, but it doesn't feel like it meshes with the core gameplay loop and ends up being used to pepper enemies from far away, which isn't why I play Bayonetta or this genre. The 2 weapon set limit still feels like shit and results in some weapons getting ignored because they are not nearly as cool or straightforward as others. Bosses in this game suck. I wasn't really a fan of any of the bosses outside of Jean in Bayonetta 1, especially with having to fight them over and over again like DMC 1, but the bosses in Bayonetta 2 feel like giant enemies in front of a ledge, but some of them there are no ledges, and you just can't fly close enough to hit them for some reason. The Lumen Sage starts out really cool, but falls into this too. I think that the flying, free range, and freeform boss fights are cool on paper. They seem to be trying to recapture what Zone of the Enders was going for with its gameplay. It just feels so awkward in this game. Maybe with better bosses or without these weird and needless barriers it could have been better. The scoring system seems to be worse in this game. I got pure platinum by just spamming one of the weapons I picked up from a boss fight rather than doing actual cool shit. Personally speaking, I don't care too much about this. I understand that for others, a huge appeal of these games is the brutal scoring system and the motivation to overcome it. I'm much more interested in doing stuff that I think looks and feels cool to pull off, even if it doesn't result in the best rating. Arguably, if the scoring system isn't quotes good, then the cool stuff you do should be rewarded, and when it fails to quantify that, it's what makes the scoring system bad. The only issue is that what people find cool and stylish isn't going to be the same for each other, so inevitably, the game is going to have to quantify it in a specific way, which is going to lead to some form of restriction or guidelines. Though, that being said, there is one thing a friend of mine told me as a design philosophy that after hearing I haven't been able to shake. If the scoring system in these types of games doesn't punish you for using items, which Bayonetta 2 doesn't, what's making it so bosses don't have bullshit gimmicks that are justified by having the crutch of healing items IV drip fed to your health bar? Bloodstained was a game that notoriously went on record that the designers of bosses had to be able to beat them with the starting weapons to show that they were fair. Bayonetta 1 also has this, where the hardest difficulty takes away witch time. It shows you that, hey, you don't need it to beat any of the enemies in the game. It is simply there to help the players on easier difficulties. The game can be completely beaten without it, and that is a really cool revelation you get if you try to sink your teeth deeper into the mechanics of this game and try the game on the hardest difficulty. You even see this on the normal difficulty at the end of the game when you encounter Gracious and Glorious. When you dodge them, they don't activate witch time. You have to overcome and use everything you've learned up until now to beat them, and I think that's really cool, even if it does initially seem like a kick in the teeth to players who aren't very good at the game even by the end. The thing that I think is the worst aspect of this game that actively hurts my enjoyment of it, as it infects every aspect and decision making when it comes to combat, is Umbran Climax. It is by far one of the worst gimmicks found in these types of games. The only reason I'm not calling it the worst gimmick I've encountered in third-person action games is because games like DMC, Devil May Cry, and Solstice have the worst gimmick, which is color-coded enemies you have to use specific weapons, or in Solstice's case, specific domes, in order harder to damage. Umbran Climax feels like the thing the game always wants you to be doing. When you aren't using it and have it available, the game is constantly asking you, why aren't you using Umbran Climax, with the big button prompt in the bottom middle of your screen constantly flashing. It's a mechanic that I feel really waters down encounters when using it, as it turns the combat into a Musou game, with its massive arena-spanning swings to catch every single enemy, which on the surface appears to be the only way you could interact, juggle, and stagger some of the larger foes you will encounter. Your base damage feels like it is nerfed in order to push you to using this. This could very well be placebo, but when looking at health bars slowly chip down in normal combat, then melt once I enter Umbran Climax, it's hard not to feel this way, even if it's somehow not the case. I would have much rather had a regular, normal-ass Devil Trigger instead of a Musou game's power meter that makes enemies go flying from my magic 30-foot sword swings. I don't hate Bayonetta 2 nearly as much as I probably made it sound like I do in the last few minutes. It's absolutely a step down from the first one, but I would definitely play it over games like DMC Devil May Cry or Solstice in its current state. I think the major factor that puts me in the category of going, yeah, this game is not really good, compared to others who absolutely detest its very existence, is the fact that I am not a high-skilled player. Just by looking at how others have described this game and their issues with it, there is a very apparent difference of things that bother them that just simply will not affect me because I don't interact with the game or those mechanics on that level. It's a game that I would definitely go back to for some mindless fun if I was for some reason in the mood to. You know, one of those games you just pop in for 30 minutes, you run through the cyber grind, you run through the bloody palace, you do some challenges for some fun to keep yourself occupied before you have to go do something else. But honestly, there are games that are just simply A, more convenient as I don't have to hook up my Switch to play them, and B, simply better games in my eyes that I could do this with, like the original Bayonetta, DMC5, or Ultra Kill. So unless I'm really craving to use one of the very specific weapons unique to this game, I sadly think that this game is going to be the one I end up ignoring. This may seem contradictive and completely antithesis to everything that I've just mentioned for the past few minutes, but still give this game a try. You might end up liking it way more than I did. As I've attempted to highlight and hopefully conveyed already in the past few minutes, I'm someone who liked it more than others already. I discussed Bayonetta 2 while playing it and making this video with a lot of my friends who dislike it way more than me, who are way better at it. So there is a very good chance that a lot of the things that I mentioned simply will not bother you. One of the many things that I dislike about making videos is how people at times will just take what I say at face value and blindly follow it, and then never try the games for themselves. Obviously, I don't want people yelling at me and completely disregarding what I actually have to say, but it's the reason why I don't use a scoring system at the end of my reviews. Review scores are things that people hone in on and focus on, completely ignoring the context of why it got that number, and how that number will differentiate from a game that has the same number or a lower one for completely different reasons. My ultimate goal in what I want to do with these videos is give the reasons why I dislike or like a game, lay everything out, and allow the viewer to come to the conclusion of whether or not they want to interact or give this thing a try. So please, even if I think Bayonetta 2 is weaker than the first one, check it out yourself if it interests you. It is a game that I think is a very divisive entry in a series, but that doesn't mean that everybody is going to feel the same way about it. But now let's take the time to finally talk about the game we've all been waiting for since that original reveal at the Game Awards all those years ago, Bayonetta 3.
Bayonetta.
So did Bayonetta 3 manage to live up to expectations? Well, I didn't really have any going into this, so I'm personally overall happy with the game, but there are some real glaring issues about it that drive me absolutely insane. If this game got a single content patch that fixed or changed a few things, I would say I like this more than one, but as of right now, that is not the case. It is going to sound harsh, but Bayonetta 3 is kind of a lopsided, uneven mess. Its highs are super high, but its lows make me want to turn the game off. It is a game with weird and mixed priorities. At times it feels like it is trying to be the DMC5 of its very series, but often that sentiment does not feel earned at all, resulting in everything around it falling flat, and at other times it's doing stuff that I don't really know what it's trying to achieve. It feels so held back by the fact that this game has to be only on the Switch. I really wish that theoretical Switch Pro with stronger hardware actually existed so this game could run at a stable solid 60 FPS just consistently without suffering in the graphics department, because even with the game's clear sacrifices, it still can't even do that. While on the topic of the visuals, let's get those out of the way right up front, and start with some of the surface level criticisms and negative aspects about the game. I'm just going to say it now, the game is pretty ugly. The color palette is really muted and drab. Faces have this really weird look to them that I don't really know how to describe, but it's triggering that uncanny valley effect in my brain. I want to point to it being a shading issue that makes their face textures look weird due to the color gradients it causes. It could also just be a texture issue itself with low resolutions making them look muddier and blurrier than intended. This game looks like what I remembered Bayonetta 1 looking in my memories when comparing it to the colorfulness of Bayonetta 2 before replaying it. Bayonetta 1 may not be as vibrant as 2, but it at least has visual clarity, and I'd argue has a better and more cohesive look compared to 3, despite 3 having higher quality things within it purely by the nature of the game coming out 13 years after the first one. In 3, it is very easy to lose track of your character in combat when the camera is zoomed out. Enemies blend in with the environments a lot because you are fighting gray and snot mint green accented monsters in gray and snot mint green environments. Eventually you'll encounter new variants that are purple and green, but they are in some of the darker levels, so the same shit happens with them too. In Bayonetta 1, all of the enemies were white with gold accents, with only a few outliers that had unique and striking colors so you couldn't possibly miss them either. How witch time affects the colors of the levels and environments in this game also greatly affects visual clarity, at least for me. In the original Bayonetta, when you activated witch time, it basically put this lens-like filter over the gameplay for a few seconds. In Bayonetta 3, it makes the environments very dark. It fills the world with this very gorgeous and striking purple. I love how it looks, but it comes at the cost of visual clarity. It makes the levels too dark and too similar to the enemies you're fighting. Combine this with the immense amount of hit sparks and particle effects from both your attacks, explosions, and enemy attacks, it is very easy to lose track of where you are and where the enemies are. It may not seem that bad to the viewer watching my gameplay now, but being in the moment, actually playing the game, trying to understand its world in a 3D space, it feels like a nightmare. It is headache-inducing. Constantly feeling like I'm being hit with sensory overload. The enemy designs unique to this game are genuinely awful. I get that they're supposed to be man-made bioweapons, but they're all homogeneous amorphous blobs. They have no personality or visual flair besides the recolors I mentioned. They'll soon become one of the most forgettable enemy designs once this game isn't fresh in my mind. Just another step down from the presentation of 2. The big gimmick of this game is the Demon Slave mechanic, which has you controlling the giant summons you've seen in torture attacks or climax finishers on bosses in the previous 2 games. So most combat encounters include your giant-ass demon and these big fuckers for them to fight, and that's where a lot of the issues with the camera stems from. They thankfully had the foresight to make the enemies somewhat transparent when standing in front of you, but with how it's implemented in the game, it makes combat encounters just as, if not more messy. Firstly, the transparency leaves these 50% opacity enemies with a lot of grain on them. I assume this is some limitation of the engine or hardware. It looks like I'm viewing combat encounters through a mesh screen on someone's back porch when these guys are in front of me. The other issue this spawns is that they can become completely invisible. There are so many points in my playthrough where it looks like I'm just swinging at the thin air in an empty arena because these enemies are completely invisible. While on the topic of large enemies and your demon summons you use to fight them, let's dig more into this mechanic. If you've played Astral Chain or V in Devil May Cry 5, it controls similar to those games. More so Astral Chain, as your demon summons function like slower, sized up versions of your stands in that game, down to having them controlled on the same button by holding down LT, leaving your player character completely vulnerable and open to attacks. Overall, I like this mechanic and the game feels pretty well built around it. If you are someone who doesn't like the idea of it or views it in the same light as Umbran Climax, then I got both good and bad news for you. The game allows you to mostly ignore the system if you want to without feeling like you're hurting yourself by not using it. Eventually you'll get an accessory that allows your kaijus to be controlled by an AI. The big risk versus reward with using them is that they can go berserk and you can lose control of them if they take too much damage. The unfortunate reality is when that happens, the camera absolutely freaks the fuck out and the game does not know how to handle it. The thing I dislike about them beyond the camera issues is that they cause somewhat of a repetitiveness in the combat with their combo finishers. Partway through the game, you get the ability to add an extra combo ender by hitting the summon button when a purple light flashes as you end your basic combo, just like how your combo enders worked with your stand in Astral Chain. chain. The enders are cool and varied, but after a while they just feel super repetitive, like viewing a summon or a chain attack in a JRPG. I can't help but feel like I'm going through the motions when it comes to doing them and watching these enders. I think the first person I saw point this out was Pat from Castle Super Beast, and I completely agree with this sentiment that at times this game feels like a sequel to Astral Chain more than a sequel to Bayonetta. This is part of what I meant when I said that this game has weird goals and weird direction that's kind of mixed in all over the place. I think it's fair to say that Platinum as a whole in the last few years has kind of gotten like this. Their design has become pretty homogenized. Rather than making a bunch of games that have unique aspects around each other, they all start to kind of blend together and borrow mechanics from each other, which I do want to say there isn't anything particularly wrong with them doing that. It's just unfortunate to see a studio that a decade ago was a trailblazer for this genre, releasing game after game that were completely unique and there was nothing else on the market that played like their games. But now, all of their games feel somewhat interchangeable with how all of the mechanics have become homogenized. At this point, I'm pretty sick of Witch Time. I think it's fine in the context of the Bayonetta series, but I really just want them to stop relying on this as a design choice in their other games that aren't Bayonetta. I completely ignored that shit in the Wonderful 101, and it's a better off game for it. The demon summons do lead to something that drives me insane when new games don't have it, and that is the ability to completely customize your control scheme. It is forgivable if it's a PlayStation 2 game or earlier, but I find it absolutely unacceptable for a game to come out in 2022 and have limited pre-made layouts. I just want to be able to put my weapon swap on LT, which it has been since the first game, and double summons on LB. For some reason, despite having RB still be the stance button, to lock onto enemies in Bayonetta 3 you now have to click in the right stick. I played this game on a Switch Pro controller, and in my opinion, this is one of the cheapest feeling controllers that I've touched. The only controller to beat it out in that cheap, flimsy plastic feeling is the PlayStation 3 controller, where if you give it any amount of pressure, it feels like it's about to snap in half. This just made locking onto enemies way more annoying than it should have been. I do not understand why locking on was separated from RB, despite everything else about RB still functioning as it was. You still needed to do certain combos, you still needed to do certain moves, so why would they move it to needing to click in one of the mushiest, cheapest, and flimsiest feeling analog sticks that I've ever touched? I can't imagine what it would be like to have to play and do this consistently on a Joy-Con. I would probably be playing in constant fear that if I used a little too much force, that I would snap off the little nub claiming to be an analog stick from Nintendo's Fisher-Price peripheral that is allegedly supposed to be used by real people to play actual video games without breaking or causing drift. I do not get how games being published by one of, if not the biggest video game company in the world, still have this issue. But seeing how Metroid Dread had this same exact issue, I don't think this is a priority on Nintendo's list. As we've already established earlier in the video, Platinum is no stranger to mini games and gimmick fights, and this game, similar to the Wonderful 101, is chock full of them, especially when it comes to the demon summons. Sadly, while cool in concept, most of them feel like shit and aren't as hype as you'd hope. I couldn't help but constantly think to myself, man, this was done better in the Wonderful 101. There are multiple set pieces where you take full control of demons, and while they are expectedly slow and lumbering, the game does not have any feedback, momentum, or visual flair, be it impact frames, camera shake, or speed lines to really sell the illusion of controlling these insanely large and powerful monsters while making it hype. There are multiple times where you control one of the many demons and you are just slowly walking through the level, and it loses all momentum and hype they were going for. These sections either needed to control faster, have smaller environments for you to traverse, or have extra flair to sell their illusion. You have these two Shin Godzilla Vs modes, and it is so slow and stiff that it deflates all hype I want to feel. This was a fight that was done better 12 years ago in No More Heroes 2. When you take control of regular Gamora, it also feels really stiff and limp. It's such a disappointment and has me somewhat worried for Project GG. I really hope this game helps them figure out what they want to do with that game and make it feel good to play. Besides the feedback and selling of the illusion I mentioned with Gamora, it also has an issue that I brought up in Bayonetta 2 but is infinitely worse here, and that is the lack of momentum. In Bayonetta 3, instead of having Panther Within, each weapon has their own unique form you could transform into with their own unique movement ability. Sadly, the lack of momentum when transforming back into human form is still present from Bayonetta 2, and the real lack of momentum period makes the movement abilities as a whole feel kneecapped. With Phantom in your spider form, you could do a web swing when triple jumping or hitting the right trigger 2 times. You'd think they'd want to have momentum for a swinging based movement ability, but instead you just limply fall to the ground at the end of your arc like a sack of bricks. You can't even redirect or throttle your movement in any meaningful way. For example, in other games with swinging abilities, or hell, even other things like horseback riding, you can pull back on the stick to slow down your movement kind of like a plane or jet. That doesn't do anything in this game. It's one of the most stiff and rigid web swings I've ever experienced. This form also has another movement ability, which is double tapping the right bumper will shoot a web and zipline you to that point. This is a great tool for gap closures with enemies in combat, so I love it there, but in the context of traversal, it is weirdly flaccid. You'd think that when you would shoot a web that latches onto thin air to slingshot you forward via magic, it would have some form of momentum, but again, like with the web swinging and general movement between forms, once you reach the end of your web, you lose all momentum and fall to the ground. The spider form also has some other weird restrictions that I can't understand their purpose for other than gating fun. I don't think this would make the game unbalanced, and even if it did, I don't care, because it would make the game actively more enjoyable to play. For starters, for some reason you can only do one web swing per touching the ground. Yes, I am asking them to let me play a budget Spider-Man game in Bayonetta 3. I don't care how unreasonable I sound. Your wall climbing is also limited. After a few seconds, you lose your grip and slide down the walls. Why? I'm a spider, let me climb around shit that you initially seem like you allow me to do. Why do I not auto-latch onto walls when I jump onto them in spider form? Instead of just instantaneously magnetizing to a wall like it does in Shinobi, I would faceplant into a wall, slide down it as I'm clipping into it, and then eventually get the chance to start climbing. But that seems to eat into the allotted time given to allow you to climb upwards before you start to slide back down. So with how this system is implemented, it just feels really counterintuitive. I don't want to sound completely negative on the Demon Masquerade mechanic because the others have some really cool features, and overall, the spider form was the one I used the most because even with how restrictive it is still fun to use. It's just the fact that it could have been even more fun. I really like the thruster boost given to you by G-Pillar. The flying form from the fans feels great and is really fun to soar through the levels. The others I will admit I used very sparingly because they were more fringe in application and because of my biggest complaint with the whole game. I've brought it up in the previous two sections, so you probably already know what it is, and that is the limitation of the two weapon sets. It is actually even more restrictive in this game compared to the previous two because you can no longer mix and match weapons with one on your hand and one on your foot. Now, for whatever reason, when you select a weapon, it goes to all four limbs. I'm guessing this is to compensate for the other mechanics in this game, like Demon Slave and Demon Masquerade, but I don't understand why you couldn't still do this and limit your forms to whatever is in your hands. This restriction is completely inexcusable to me, as most of the weapons are incredibly fun and satisfying to use, but there's nothing you can do other than to ignore all but two. The game has 14 weapons, including Bayonetta 1 and 2's guns if you have the save file for those games. Why not give you more sets? Or if you're gonna leave me with two, why not also give me a weapon wheel? There is a weapon wheel in the fucking bloated upgrade skill tree that locks basic shit you had at the start of the previous two games. Why not make it so if you tap the weapon swap button, you go from set 1 to set 2, and then if you hold the weapon swap button, it opens a weapon wheel that either slows down time or completely pauses the game so you can select your weapons. As it is now, if you want to change out your weapons, you have to pause the game and go through these slow ass menus, which just feels so cumbersome. If you are in the middle of an attack, you can't even swap your weapons, so that only adds to more restriction and breaks the flow of combat. If they patched in either of my two suggestions today, this would easily improve the game by a full point. You know, if I was actually scoring the games I cover in these reviews. I've never seen a game with so many fun tools that actively doesn't want you using them. This is the most counterintuitive shit I've ever seen. Your summons are also limited to only 3 on the D-pad. I would love to be able to bind multiple to each arrow and just rotate through them. Give me the option to have all of them or just the basic 3. I'd be fine if this was a post-game unlock as to not overload new players like DMC5 did, where you could equip every weapon as Dante once you beat the game a single time and bought the upgrade from the shop. I still can't get over how they tacked on needless unlocks in this game by simply taking away moves that you had at the start in others. Did they fear that people would get bored with not having things to work towards? Personally, I can't stand unlocking shit in these types of games anymore if it's a long-running series. I don't give a fuck. I am tired of unlocking Stinger in every single new DMC game. What's worse about it here is that they are not even unique moves that you have to get. They are tied to each weapon. You have to get Stinger and the basic launcher for every single weapon each time you get a new one. Why? Once you do get all these upgrades, and honestly even before, the combat itself is a ton of fun. If we had more options to allow you to use all of the weapons, or at least more than the game does now, I would say I like the game's combat and weapon selection over Bayonetta 1's. The only thing I would be missing is the nunchucks and Panther momentum. Though the train saw continues to prove that Cavalier is the best type of chainsaw weapon in this genre, it's something about the perfect amount of hit stop it has and how it suspends enemies in the air that just hasn't been replicated in any game and ends up making all the other ones feel way more flaccid. Though if I was to give a criticism to the weapons in Bayonetta 3, it is that the slow and lumbering ones all feel kind of interchangeable and aren't fun. I may be missing something about them, but I do not find G-Pillar or the Anchor weapon very fun to use. As for new gameplay additions, I found Viola's combat to be fun. I enjoy how she is a completely different approach to combat with having to parry, which is way harder to do than dodging in my opinion. Her lackluster dodge really sells the need for you to get your timings down, as you can't rely on flying across the screen in order to dodge attacks even if you aren't timing them well. The detection for her charge attacks seems a little finicky from my experience. I don't know if it was because of my controller, how I was pushing the buttons, or the game itself registering inputs, but it would think that I wanted to charge my attack when I would press the button without holding it long enough for me to feel like it should have registered charging. This resulted in me just mash tapping her attacks so I wouldn't accidentally mess up my combo because the game would think I wanted to do a charge attack. I do think her gameplay is somewhat lacking. They definitely need to give her some more tools if she is supposed to be the new protagonist. I was hoping she would get a new weapon or something, but her gameplay doesn't evolve too much from your initial impression. The only thing she gets is after her second mission she unlocks a devil trigger, and I found it very disappointing. It plays like a worse anti-form Sora where you mash the attack button and she teleports to her enemies. It's pretty damn mindless. Part of me wants to say that she doesn't feel designed for large enemies like Bayo is, despite having a summon of her own. It felt way easier to lose track of her when fighting large enemies. Since you don't have the same level of mobility as Bayo because of your intentionally poor dodge, you can't reposition yourself so enemies aren't obstructing your vision or turning completely invisible and you aren't able to tell if you're hitting them. The big enemies in general aren't really fun to fight when not using the demon summons, and Cheshire is controlled by an AI by default, so that also could be adding to the lackluster feeling versus big enemies as Viola. When it comes to bugs and glitches, I only experienced one, but it was pretty major, so it needs to get patched at some point. In Bayonetta 1 and 2, there is this trumpeter enemy you'll encounter. They'll shoot a giant orb at you, and their windup has a very specific loud audio cue to indicate it's coming. You don't really encounter them that much, so for most of my playthrough I thought that they just simply removed this feature before asking people about it on Twitter, and then finally hearing it a single time later. So I concluded that yes, this is a bug. The sound effect is there, it's just incredibly quiet when it does play. When testing this later after my full playthrough, this bug later revealed to me that Bayo 3 broke one of the first game's hard rules, which made it incredibly balanced, and that is enemies don't attack when off screen. So now with this glitch, you just have zero idea that there are incoming projectiles shot behind you off screen until it is too late. This audio bug brings me to my second big issue with Bayonetta 3 outside of its weapon set limit, and that is the sound mixing and overall presentation surrounding audio. So many of this game's cutscenes have the quietest music to the point it feels ambient or non-existent. Things that should be incredibly hype fall completely flat because they come off like I'm looking at incomplete cutscenes that haven't properly been mixed yet. Some of this is made worse by my TV speakers clearly not being up to snuff, which is a common problem with modern flat screens, as it does sound slightly better when watching my recordings back on my PC, but this is more so adding insult to injury rather than the speakers being the source of the problem. Already low mixed things that shouldn't be that quiet and are in risk of being drowned out completely just can't be heard on my TV. At times it really feels like the audio was an afterthought, like when I have been working on a video for a really long time and just want to get the damn thing out the door, so I slap some random music that I have saved at -20 decibels and hit render. This only becomes more frustrating and apparent as an issue after Mission 12's rhythm game boss. This segment is legitimately amazing and makes me wish that the rest of the game had this level of care. Sound effects lack a real oomph to them that sells the impact, or are straight up missing, leading to more of that rushed and incomplete feeling. Let me play an example for you and then a similar scene from another game. As you can see here, there are no sound effects when Bayonetta lands or interacts with the ground. Some sound effects like the necklace breaking are also out of sync, but in DMC5, Nero's impact makes multiple sound effects as he crashes into the ground, and even small details like pieces of rubble or Nero stumbling creates something to be heard. Sound has been conveyed in a very specific way in movies and by extension games for the past 60 plus years. Even if it is not representative of reality, it has become a reality of its own in media. When done right, ideally you don't even notice it, but when done poorly, it sticks out like a sore thumb. Lacking presentation can be even found in things like the QTEs and their prompts. I know this must sound really nitpicky, but here is a side-by-side of the QTE prompts from Bayonetta 1 and 3. Look how more animated the ones from the original game are, and by comparison how stilted and stiff the QTEs are presented in 3. The game also feels like there is a distinct lack of QTEs compared to the previous two games. I know a lot of people hate QTEs no matter the context, but I think they can enhance an experience when done right. There were plenty of cutscenes in this game where I thought that there could be one. So many long cutscenes where I wished I was actually fighting the boss, or at least having some fun QTE to do something instead of just watching all the cool stuff happen out of my control. When QTEs do show up, they are often my least favorite, which are wiggling the left analog stick. I have no proof that this is a thing, but I swear that this speeds up controller drift. The complaint I've had with QTEs in all three games is still present, which is you don't know which one they're going to be until they happen, and the fact that the Switch does not have colored buttons adds to the problem by you not being able to tell which one it is at a glance. Let's wrap up this video by finishing off on the story of this game. Now I want to say up front that Bayonetta 1's story is the only one I like in the series. I found 3's story to be rather lacking, but not nearly as bad as 2's. 3 does have its own version of Fimbulwinter, which is
the multiverse. The multiverse.
The multiverse.
Multiverse.
Take a shot every time someone brings up the multiverse and you'll be drunk by the end of Viola meeting the playable Bayonetta for the first time. I describe my stance towards Bayo 3's story as almost apathetic or indifferent. By the time the game introduced an alternate reality Luca that looks like fucking Viego from League of Legends, I was completely checked out of the story. So when I see the massive amount of hate that this game's story gets, I feel like an alien or the odd man out. I'm not going to come up to bat and say that this game's narrative is misunderstood or anything, but the level of vitriol I've seen seems a bit excessive for a game like this. One of my problems with the story is that Jean and Bayonetta are as competent or as stupid as the plot needs them to be to move it forward. They establish at the start that these bioweapons are hard to sense as they get the drop on multiple people, including Rodin, but with how formulaic the game's structure is, you can't help but feel like it's really stupid and forced. How were the alternate universe Bayonettas dealt with so they can't join forces with us? Well, they turn around and got hit from behind and died. Jean, who he spent the entire previous game trying to save after getting dragged to hell, dies to a paraplegic in a fishbowl with a knife on his stick attached to his wheelchair. How did she not sense this? Why did she not just dodge with the which time spider sense bullshit we've seen the duo do time and time again? The repetitive structure I mentioned ends up making a lot of the levels kind of bleed together in my mind. Pretty much the entire game is as follows. You get to a new place, you'll see some sort of memory thing of either this universe's Bayonetta or Jean, you'll get temporary access to the new demon you'll unlock at the end of this segment of the game, and do some specific puzzles or set pieces with them. Then they'll go back to their Bayonetta, maybe you will have a set piece where you play as one of the other demons you already control in a segment that feels like shit. You'll eventually encounter the final boss of that level. This universe's Bayonetta dies or is about to. Our Bayonetta rips out her heart and does one of the unique super powered up demon summon minigame set pieces. We somewhat foil the main villain's plan and set him back. We get the Chaos Emerald MacGuffin and then skip town before this universe falls apart. The other Bayonettas don't really have a personality of their own, as you barely see them outside of the Egyptian Bayonetta, which is by far the best one because she feels like she has a mini arc after seeing the memories of her being reluctant when talking to her version of Jean, and then seeing her sacrifice herself to save our Bayonetta at the end of her level. The rest of them are more so cool what-ifs that go underutilized due to killing them off instead of either joining forces with us or combining like some sort of Piccolo and Nail type shit. The main villain of this game might be worse than the dude from 2. I couldn't tell you what his motivation was from just watching the cutscenes. I'm pretty sure most of his story is in those logs that I didn't read, which is on me, but personally I think I should be able to get at least some sort of idea of what the main bad guy's motivation is from cutscenes other than he wants to control the multiverse or some shit. I mentioned at the start of this section that this game feels like it wants to be the Devil May Cry 5 of its own series, but it fails to have that emotion behind it that sold everything DMC5 was going for. Pretty much everything feels unearned or forced. I have mentioned to some friends how this game feels like Bayonetta 4 and that I skipped over a fictional Bayonetta 3 that was supposed to set up all of the things that this game pays off. For a game that wants to pass the torch, you'd think that Viola would have more than 3 levels and actually interact with Bayonetta more than the same comedy routine every single time. These characters do not have conversations. They have sitcom bits that they run into the ground. Another analogy I've described to this game compared to Devil May Cry 5 is that DMC5 is the MCU, where it had an entire game to set up Nero and his dynamic with Dante. They had an entire series for it to set up Dante and Virgil's feud in 5, and Nero actually plays a massive role through 5, unlike Viola, who gets kicked into fart gas and isn't seen for like another 2 hours until the very end of the game. If she is supposed to be the new protagonist going forward, inheriting the Bayonetta name, maybe she shouldn't have jobbed in the final fight and actually did something. Plot beats in DMC5 are actually set up and paid off from both within the game itself and the entire Devil May Cry mythos, down to the books that no one read and even referencing DMC Devil May Cry. Bayonetta 3 is the DC cinematic universe in this analogy, where they just shove a bunch of shit into one thing and then hope it all works out. Maybe some of it could have worked, but as is, things like Luca and Bayo actually being in a serious relationship feels like we've missed some massive development between these two characters, so it wouldn't end up feeling like something dropped on our heads at the end of the game. Yeah, they've always playfully flirted and bantered, but that next step to actually getting close enough to have a child feels like something that we should have seen to some extent, even if they wanted to keep the reveal of Viola being their child a surprise for the end of the game. That being said, for all of its weirdly introduced plot beats, lack of breathing room for any moment or idea, the ending does contain some genuinely hype moments that makes me remember those high highs of this series. Seeing all the alternate Bayonettas behind you as you fight the final boss was super cool, even if all the ones that weren't actually playable characters in this game were clearly concept art PNGs with a warble effect over them. Yeah, it's 100% fan service to make you pog and point at the screen, but seeing the original Bayonettas from 1 and 2 show up and getting to play as them with the old HUD was honestly worth it. The visual effects when all three fuse together looks great too. It's a real shame that the start and stop feeling of this final fight somewhat takes away from all of these cool moments, as you think, we're finally going to beat him with this power-up, and then nope, only to do another thing that didn't work either. A bunch of stuff in the final hour just happens and then immediately is shown to not matter at all. Obviously, Luca was not going to die from falling off this cliff, but the game does present it like this, only to then seconds later have the other fairy Luca save him. And then Luca valiantly sacrifices himself so Bayonetta and Viola can get back out of the Alphaverse and into their universe to stop Singularity. But of course, that doesn't matter either, as he shows up 5 minutes later. The original Bayonetta 1 and 2 show up and then they fight him, and it seems like, oh, maybe they're strong enough to beat him. Nope, they job too. Then all three fuse together to have this super cool moment, but that doesn't matter either. It isn't until Luca shows up so him and Bayonetta can have a tag match with Singularity that they are finally strong enough to beat him. Like I said 2 paragraphs ago, Viola probably should have been the one to beat him, as they even frame it like she's going to overcome the mistake she did at the beginning of the game when she failed to beat him and watched her Bayonetta die. But instead, she just gets flung to the side and jobs again. And with the game ending on all of these pointless power-ups that just felt like a waste of time, you would think that Viola's fairy transformation would have any bearing on the plot. Other than when she unlocked it halfway through the game, it has had no narrative bearing at all and never comes up again. Why not use it here to show that Viola has grown from her journey? Instead, it ends up just being another idea thrown on the pile of things that happen in this game for some reason, but end up either going nowhere or having an assigned importance that I really couldn't get behind, and it felt really forced, like the whole Arc Adam, Arc Eve shit. I'm sorry, Bayonetta 3. I know I was just trying to compliment you about how cool the ending was and actually brought it back for me slightly, but I ended up criticizing you again. Like I said at the beginning of this review, Bayonetta 3 is all over the place, vastly varying in quality from hour to hour. The fact that this has to be tied to the Switch feels like someone trying to swim with lead shoes. I wish that this game was the big, flawless slam dunk it should have been, but I am still happy I played it and glad that this game exists. I am more interested in going back and playing this game over 2, but like I said at the end of the Bayonetta 2 section, it being tied to the Switch just isn't convenient for me to go back and run through a couple levels to waste some time, and with how the Witch Trials randomly restricts your loadouts to before and after fights makes me not want to put time into it compared to the Angel Slayer from 1. Maybe some community patches and mods for Yuzu will fix some of the blemishes of this game if Platinum doesn't end up patching it. It sucks to say, but Bayonetta 3 will probably be a pretty sick launch title for whatever next console Nintendo makes. If you've made it this far into the video, I just want to say thanks for watching as always. If you really liked the video, please leave a like and comment. And don't forget to subscribe and pass the video around. If you really want to help support the channel, maybe consider becoming a patron on Patreon. All patrons get access to videos a day early, along with a $7 tier that allows you to view rough cuts of upcoming videos. I'm now going to shout out all of my $5 and up patrons who really help support the channel. Bully, Densha, Lucy the Fox, Salt and Sweet Rum, Sir Newt Newt, Scary Dinosaur, Curtis Harris, Elliot Morton, Francisco Bartles, Jeff Ladd, Kohai Carmen, Lotto, Medi Not the Bad Guy, Nathan Redding, Nemphy, Quanner, Quartz, Quench the Void, Samuel Egan, Sayan Heggie, Slemph Tingle, Walkman, Akita Fishkiyama, BBF in Bloxburg, NM, Revin, Cosmonaut Cola, Rovit, Ben Johnson, Buckets, Bergnut, Chichometrius, Ekfrazo, Filthy Fingers 69, Fishkami, Hardleg Joe, Kazmarkchik, Kevin Velasquez, Megan, Nicholas Pedinato, Rabies, Starcasters, Some Panda, The Worstest Guy, William Moore, and David Roberts. Thanks so much, guys. As for what's coming out next, I have a bunch of videos in production. I am currently working on a Gungrave video, a Solstice video, and a Callisto Protocol video. I don't know when those will be out. If any of them might get canceled, I don't think they will, but you never know. I'm also slowly chipping away at Armored Core, but who knows whenever that's going to be out, because there's 15 games I have to cover, I think. So if you really want to help support me, as videos take really long to make, I haven't uploaded in like 2 months since I'm working on a bunch of stuff that just isn't out yet, then the Patreon really helps out. I also have a NordVPN affiliate link in the description below using my promo code, and I also have a TCG Player affiliate link in the description below. Any purchases you make while checking out using that link will give me a small kickback. And I think that's pretty much it. I might have a Christmas video coming out on Christmas Day, but no promises. So I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and as always, thanks for watching, and see you next time.